The market square at Fenwick smelled of hay and warm bread and horse. It was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were always the loudest days in the little town, because that was when the farmers came down from the hills with their carts and their wives and their loud opinions about the price of butter. The sun was high and yellow, and the cobbles were hot under her boots. And somewhere a fiddler was playing a tune that had no name. Maren Ashcombe walked between the stalls with a basket on her arm and a list in her head. Her list was short: onions, and a bit of thread, and a paper of pins, and, if the money stretched, a bit of ribbon for her mother's Sunday cap. She did not think the money would stretch. It rarely did. But she liked to hope, because hoping was cheap and it made the walking feel lighter. She stopped at the onion stall and set down her basket. The onion woman knew her and gave her a small nod. Maren nodded back and picked through the pile with careful fingers. She chose the firm ones and left the soft ones. She had learned young that a soft onion was a lie waiting to happen, and lies. Even small ones made her tired. Around her, the market moved like a river. Women laughed. Men shouted prices. A boy chased a chicken between two carts, and the chicken flapped and shrieked and flew up onto a bench where a fat man sat eating a pie. The fat man cursed. The boy caught the chicken. The women laughed again. It was in every way a very ordinary Tuesday. Maren paid for her onions. She counted the coins twice, because she always counted twice. Then she moved on toward the thread woman's stall, which was near the fountain in the middle of the square. Her boots were old, and one of them was letting in a small stone, but she did not stop to shake it out. She would shake it out at home. She was halfway to the fountain when the noise changed. She did not know how to explain what she meant by that, even later when people asked her. The market did not go quiet. It got louder. But the loudness was a different kind. It was the loudness of shouting, and running feet, and a woman screaming a name that was not her own. And under all of it, there was a sound that Maren felt more than she heard. A drumming. A heavy, steady drumming, like a great door being pounded with a fist made of stone. She stopped walking. She turned her head. At the far end of the square, past the ale seller's cart and the pen where the sheep were kept, the crowd had split like a loaf of bread being torn in two. People were running. Not in one direction, but in all directions. The way water runs when you tip a bucket onto a flat table. A man dropped a basket of apples, and the apples rolled everywhere, red and shining, and no one bent to pick them up. Through the gap in the crowd came the bull. He was black, and he was enormous, and his eyes were the color of old blood. There was a rope trailing from his neck, cut short and frayed at the end, as though someone had tried to hold him and had lost. His hooves struck the cobbles with a sound that Maren had never heard before, a sound like hammers on iron. Foam ran from his mouth, his head was low, and his shoulders were high, and every muscle in him was moving at once. The bull charged the market crowd. Maren stood still. She did not know why. Later, when she thought about it, she would try to find a reason, and she would fail. It was not bravery. Bravery is when you know you are afraid, and you choose to stay. She was not afraid. She was, for one strange stretched moment, not anything at all. The world had gone very quiet in her head, even though outside her head it was still screaming. And she watched the bull come with the same calm curiosity she felt when she watched a storm from the kitchen window. People ran past her. A woman knocked into her shoulder and did not stop. A child was scooped up by its father, and the father's coat brushed her arm, and she smelled his sweat and his fear. Someone shouted her name, she thought, but she was not sure. The fountain water was still trickling behind her, a small silver sound under all the big loud ones. The bull came on. He was closer now, close enough that she could see the mud on his knees and the scar across his shoulder, and the way his breath came out of him in short, hard puffs, like a bellows working too hard. He was not looking at her, exactly. He was looking at everything. He was looking for a way out, and he was not finding one, and the not finding was making him bigger and blacker with every step. She heard hooves, different hooves, lighter, faster, coming from her left. She did not look. She was looking at the bull. The horse came into the edge of her vision like a piece of the sky falling down. It was grey, and it was moving faster than any horse she had ever seen move in a town square. The rider was low over its neck. His hat was gone, his coat was dark, and it was flying behind him like a wing, and his hand was already reaching, though she did not understand at first what he was reaching for. He was reaching for her. His arm came around her waist like a rope. It did not feel gentle. It felt like being hit by a door. The air went out of her in one hard sound, and then she was off the ground, and then she was on the horse, sideways, half across the saddle, her cheek pressed against wool that smelled of rain and leather and something else she could not name. Her basket was gone. Her onions were rolling on the cobbles with the apples, and she thought, quite clearly, well, that is that then. The horse turned. The bull passed. She felt the wind of him, the great hot wind of a great hot animal moving very fast, and she smelled him too, the sharp animal smell of a creature at the end of its patience. Then the horse was moving again, not toward the bull but away from it, into a narrow street where the walls closed in on both sides and the noise of the market dropped away. The horse stopped. She could hear it breathing. She could hear the man breathing. She could hear her own heart, which had apparently decided to remember that it existed, and was now making up for lost time by beating twice as hard as it usually did. "Down," the man said. His voice was quiet. It was not the quiet of a man who was calm. It was the quiet of a man who was so angry he did not trust himself with a louder voice. She slid down. Her boots hit the ground. She put a hand against the wall of the nearest house, because her legs had decided to be interesting about the whole business. The stone of the wall was warm from the sun. She pressed her palm against it and made herself breathe. The man swung down from the horse. She looked up. He was tall. That was the first thing. Not the sort of tall that made you tip your head all the way back, but the sort of tall that meant you had to look up if you wanted to see his face. And she wanted to see his face. His hair was dark and damp with sweat at the temples. His eyes were a color she could not decide on, something between grey and green, like the sea on a day when the weather could not make up its mind. There was dust on his jaw. There was a small red mark on his cheek where a branch, or perhaps her own hair, had caught him. He was looking at her as though he could not decide whether to shake her or check her for broken bones. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No, you did not run." "No, why?" It was not a question, quite. It was the shape of a question with all the softness scraped off it. She thought about it. She was not one to answer without thinking, and even now, with her heart still trying to climb out of her chest, she was not going to lie. "I do not know," she said. He stared at her. "You do not know." No, he opened his mouth. He closed it. He turned away from her, and he walked 3 steps down the little street, and he put his hand against the wall the way she had done. And he stood there with his head down for a long moment. She watched him. She watched the way his shoulders moved when he breathed. She watched the way one of his hands was still shaking, a fine tremor she did not think he knew about. She watched the way the sun caught the sweat on the back of his neck. When he turned back, his face was set again, but something in his eyes had changed. "Your name," he said. "Maren Ashcombe." "Who are your people?" "My mother. She lives on Wren Lane. My father is dead." He nodded once. That seemed to be all he needed. He was not, she saw, a man who asked questions to be polite. He asked questions because he wanted the answers. "I am Alistair Rook," he said. "Duke of Corvan. That was my bull." She looked at him. She did not know what to do with that piece of information, so she did not do anything with it. She simply held it, the way she had held the onions before the basket had gone. "I am sorry for your bull," she said after a moment. He almost laughed. She saw it happen, the almost a small twitch at the corner of his mouth that he did not let become anything more. He shook his head slowly. "You are the most peculiar woman I have ever met," he said, "and I have met a great many peculiar women. I am not peculiar. You did not run. Neither did you." He looked at her again, and this time the look was longer, and it went deeper, and she felt it the way she had felt the wind of the bull passing, only slower. She did not look away. She was not, she found, capable of looking away just then. There was something in the little street that had gone very still, and she was standing in the middle of it, and so was he. Somewhere back in the square, someone was still shouting. Someone else was calling for a doctor. A woman was crying, not loudly, the way women cried when the fright had passed, and there was room, finally, for the tears. Life was starting again. Life always started again. "You must let me see you home," he said. "There is no must about it. There is. I owe you a basket of onions at the least." She almost smiled. She did not quite let it happen, but she felt the shape of it inside her mouth. "Wren Lane is not far," she said. "Then it will not take long." He did not offer his arm. She was grateful. She did not think she could have taken it without her hands showing the tremor that his had shown. He led the horse by its reins, and she walked on his other side, and they went down the little street toward the wider one, and neither of them spoke. Her mother did not cry when Maren came home. Her mother had lived too long to cry over things that had not, in the end, happened. She looked at her daughter, and then at the Duke, and then at her daughter again, and she said, "You had better come in, both of you." Her mother's kitchen smelled of soup and rosemary. There was a fire in the small grate, though it was summer, because her mother was always cold now. A cat slept on the window ledge with one paw hanging down. There was a chip out of the corner of the table where Maren had dropped a hammer as a child, and the chip had never been mended, because it had never needed to be. It was, Maren thought, an ordinary room. She saw the Duke look at all of it, and she saw him decide, very quietly, that he was not going to look at any of it as though it were less than it was. He would not sit until her mother sat. He would not drink until her mother drank. He answered her mother's questions in a voice that was quieter than the one he had used in the street, and he did not once look at Maren while he answered them, though Maren could feel the not looking as clearly as she would have felt the looking. When he stood to go, her mother stood too. She was a small woman, and she had to tip her head back to look at him, but she did it without any nervousness at all. Her mother had never been afraid of dukes, or of anyone. Her mother had been afraid, once of a fever, and once of a bailiff, and never of a person. "Thank you, Your Grace," her mother said, "for my girl. It was my animal, madam. It was your hand that took her from him." He did not answer that. He bowed to her mother, and then more briefly to Maren. Then he went out. The door closed behind him. His horse's hooves sounded on the cobbles outside, slower now, walking, going away. Her mother sat down. She looked at Maren. "Well," her mother said. "Well," Maren said. "You did not run." "No, why?" Maren looked at the fire. She thought about the drumming of the hooves. She thought about the black bull and his old blood eyes. She thought about the man's arm around her waist, and the smell of rain and leather, and the way he had put his hand on the wall of the little street and not been ashamed to let her see him do it. "I do not know," she said. Her mother nodded. Her mother had always been a woman who could accept an "I do not know" and not push at it. She reached across the table and patted Maren's hand once, and then she went back to peeling a potato that had been half peeled when Maren had left the house that morning. 2 days later, an arrangement was made. Maren was not in the room when it began. She was upstairs, mending a stocking, because a stocking was a thing that could be mended, and she liked that week to fix what could be fixed. She heard the knock at the door. She heard her mother's step. She heard voices, low, careful. She did not, at first, try to listen. Then she did. She could not make out the words, but she could make out the shape of them. The voices went on for a long time. Once her mother laughed, small and surprised. Once there was a silence so long that Maren set down the stocking and thought about going down. She did not go down. She waited. When her mother came up at last, her mother's face was strange. It was not sad, and it was not glad. It was the face of a woman who had been handed a very heavy thing and had not yet decided where to put it. "Maren," her mother said, "sit down." "I am sitting." "Then hear me." Her mother told her. Her mother told her plainly, because her mother had never known any other way to tell anything. The Duke of Corvin had come. He had come with a proposal. It was not, her mother said, a proposal of the sort that a young woman might expect a duke to bring. It was a matter of practicality. There were reasons, her mother said. There were reasons on his side, and there were reasons on their side, and if Maren would listen, her mother would tell them all. The reasons on his side were these. His grandmother, who was old and formidable, and who held certain funds in trust, had told him in the spring that if he was not married by his 30th birthday, which fell in the autumn, she would give those funds elsewhere. He did not need the funds for himself. He needed them for tenants and a school he had promised, and a bridge that must be built before winter, or people would drown in the spring floods. He had told his grandmother that he would marry. He had not, until Tuesday, known whom. The reasons on their side were these. Maren's mother was ill. Not gravely, not yet, but ill in the slow way that women who had worked hard all their lives grew ill. There was no money for a physician who could do more than shake his head. There was no money for the medicines that might have kept her strong. There was, if Maren married this man, money for all of that, and for a cottage by the sea if she wished it, and for a fire that never went out. He said, her mother said, that you were not to answer today. He said you were to have a week. He said if you said no, no arrangement would be made about anything, and I was to have the physician anyway. He was very clear about that. Maren sat very still on the edge of the bed. The stocking was in her lap. Her fingers had gone cold. She could hear, outside the window, a bird singing the same 3 notes over and over, as though it could not remember the 4th. A week, she said. A week. He wants a wife who will keep his grandmother happy. He wants, her mother said carefully, a wife who will not run when a bull comes. Maren looked at her mother. Her mother looked back. Neither of them smiled. But something passed between them that was not quite a smile and not quite a sadness, and Maren stood up, and she went to the window, and she watched the bird until it flew away. She did not take a week. She took 4 days. On the 4th day, she walked to the inn where the Duke had left word he could be reached, and she asked the innkeeper to send a boy to fetch him. And she waited in the small parlour with the smell of ale and old pipe smoke and floor polish in her nose. He came within the hour. He was dressed as he had been dressed the first day, more or less. Clean, but not fine. He did not, she thought, like to be looked at, and dressing plainly was a way of not being looked at, and she understood that. Because she had spent years not wanting to be looked at herself. He sat down across from her at the small scarred table. He did not speak first. He waited. "I will marry you," she said. He nodded once. That was, for a moment, all. She had thought he might say something. Perhaps a thank you. Perhaps a small warm word to soften the corners of the thing. He did not. He looked at her steadily, and she looked back, and she saw, for the second time, the small tremor in his hand where it lay on the table. He was not, she realized, calm. He was only quiet. The two things, she thought, were not the same. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them. My mother is to have the physician now, not after the wedding." "Now, agreed. I will not pretend to a fine lady's ways in front of your grandmother. If she wants a fine lady, she must find one for herself. I will be civil. I will be nothing more." "Agreed. You will not lie to me. If there is a thing I ought to know, you will tell me. If there is a thing you are ashamed of, you will still tell me. I would rather know an ugly truth than believe a pretty lie." He looked at her a long time before he answered that one. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the little street, as though he were reading a page of a book he had not expected to find in a place like this. "Agreed," he said at last. "The same, from you." "The same." They shook hands across the scarred table. His hand was warm and rough with rains and rains and rains, she thought. This was a man who rode. His grip was not soft. She did not want it to be. They let go. Her hand felt very cold when he took his back. The wedding was small. It was in a stone church with green light coming through the one good window, and it smelled of old prayer books and beeswax candles and the faint damp of a building that had stood a long time in an English field. Her mother was there. His grandmother was not. A curate stood as one witness. The Duke's steward stood as the other. There was no music. There were no flowers, except for a small posy of white stock that her mother had picked from the little bit of garden behind their house that morning, and had pressed into Maren's hand as they walked to the church. Maren wore the best dress she had, which was grey, and clean and old. She had put a bit of lace at the collar because her mother had wept once when she had refused the lace, and she did not want her mother to weep on this day. The lace scratched her neck. She did not mind. She stood very straight beside the man who was becoming her husband, and she said the words the curate told her to say. And she felt his hand take hers when the moment came for it, and she felt the ring go on, cold and heavy and too big by half. He looked at her, when it was done, as though he wanted to say something and did not know what. She looked back, the same. Neither of them said anything. They walked out of the church into the yellow sunlight, and her mother stepped forward. And her mother put both hands on Marin's face for a moment, and then let go. "I will bring the physician tomorrow," the Duke said to her mother. "He is a good man. He will not talk down to you." Her mother laughed, small. "I should like to see the man who could." He almost smiled at that. Marin saw it happen again, the almost. She was beginning to think that she might, one day, learn how to make it not stop at almost. She did not, that day, know how. The House of Corvan was not what she had expected. She had expected something grand and cold, a place with echoes in it. She had, in her mind, prepared herself for echoes. Instead, the house was long and low, and made of a pale stone that had gone gold in the evening light. And it sat in a fold of hills with a river running behind it, and when the carriage came up the drive she saw a hound bound out from a doorway, and stop and stare at the carriage with its ears up and its tail moving. It was, she thought, a house that had been loved. That did not mean it was warm. Only that it had been loved. Once he handed her down from the carriage. His hand was steady. She kept hers steady too. The housekeeper was on the step. The housekeeper was a wide woman with a red face and small kind eyes, and she curtsied to Marin with a curtsy that was exactly as deep as courtesy required, and not 1 inch more. Marin liked her at once. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said to him. "Mrs. Bell, this is my wife." The housekeeper's eyes moved to Marin. Marin saw the assessment happen. It was quick and thorough, and it was not, she thought, unkind. Mrs. Bell curtsied to her as well, and this time the curtsy was a hair deeper, which meant a great deal in a house where hairs of curtsies mattered. "Your Grace," Mrs. Bell said. "Welcome home." Home was a large word for a place she had never been. Marin did not correct it. She only nodded, and she followed Mrs. Bell up the wide, shallow steps and into a hall that smelled of beeswax and lavender and, faintly, of dog. The dog she had seen from the carriage was there in the hall now, sitting with its long tail sweeping the flagstones, watching her with eyes as brown as tea. "Barnaby," the Duke said. Manners. Barnaby did not have manners. Barnaby came to her at once and pressed his great warm head into her hand, and she stood in the hall of a house she did not know with a dog, she did not know pressed against her palm, and she felt something small and unexpected happen inside her chest. Not warmth, quite, but the shape of a warmth that might one day come. He watched her. She saw it out of the corner of her eye. She did not look at him. She scratched Barnaby behind the ears, and Barnaby leaned into it with the whole of his body, and the Duke said, "From behind her he does not do that. He seems to be doing it. He does not do that with anyone." She did look at him then. He was standing with his hat in his hand and his hair a little rumpled from the carriage. And he was looking at his dog and at her hand on his dog, and his face had gone still in the way she was learning to read. "Perhaps he does now," she said. "Perhaps he does." They went in to supper an hour later. He led her to the dining room and pulled her chair for her, and sat down at the head of the table, which put a great deal of polished wood between them. She looked down the length of that wood. She looked at him. He looked back. "This is silly," she said. "It is silly. You are too far away to pass the salt." "I am." He picked up his plate. He picked up his glass. He walked the length of the table and set them down beside hers, and he pulled out the chair next to hers and sat down in it, and he said, "Better?" Better, they ate. It was a plain supper, better than she was used to, but not so grand as she had feared. There was chicken, and there was bread, and there was a small dish of stewed apples. They talked about the road from the town. They talked about the river. They talked about how Barnaby had been a small round puppy who had chewed a curtain. They did not talk about the bull. They did not talk about his grandmother. They did not talk about the wedding, though she still had the ring on her hand and could feel its weight every time she reached for her cup. When she went up to bed, he did not come with her. She had not expected him to. Their arrangement had not, in so many words, addressed that question, but she had understood, from the way he had looked at her at the church, that he was not a man who would take a thing that had not been given. She was grateful. She lay in the wide, strange bed with its heavy hangings, and she listened to the house settle around her, and she thought that she might in time learn how to sleep here. She was almost asleep when she heard the small sound. It was a scratching at her door. Very soft. Very patient. She lay still for a moment. Then she got up and went to the door, and she opened it, and Barnaby walked past her into the room as though he had been coming to bed there every night of his life. He climbed onto a rug at the foot of the bed. He turned 3 times. He lay down. He put his great head on his great paws and closed his eyes. Maren stood by the open door for a moment. She looked down the hall. There was no one there. She thought, though, that she could see, at the far end, where the light of a candle came out from under a door, a shape that shifted, once, as though a man had been standing in that light and had just now turned away. The door closed. The candle went out. She closed her own door and went back to bed, and she slept with the dog breathing steadily on the rug, and it was the best sleep she had had in a year. The first week was polite. That was the word for it. Polite, he rose early. She rose earlier. They took breakfast together because it seemed the thing to do. He asked her whether she had slept well. She said yes. She asked him whether the estate had been quiet in the night. He said yes. They passed the butter. They passed the honey. They did not touch when they passed things, though once his sleeve brushed her wrist, and she felt it as though it had been a hot iron, and she was ashamed of herself for feeling it, and she did not let it show. He went out to the estate work in the mornings. She stayed in the house and learned it. Mrs. Bell walked her through room after room, and Maren asked practical questions, and Mrs. Bell answered them, and by the end of the first week Maren knew where every set of keys was kept, and which chimneys smoked, and which of the maids had a mother who was ill, and which of the footmen was courting a girl at a farm 2 miles off. She wrote down none of it. She did not need to. Her mother had taught her to remember, because her mother had said a woman who could not remember was a woman who was always being surprised, and being surprised was expensive. On the 8th day the friction came. It was over a small matter. It usually is. Maren had gone into the kitchen and had seen the cook, a thin grey woman named Mrs. Pike, taking a scolding from the butler over some question of the meat pies. Mrs. Pike was standing with her hands folded in her apron, and her mouth was tight, and her eyes were bright with the sort of shine that meant tears were waiting behind them, though she would not let them come. Maren watched for a moment from the doorway. She did not like it. She did not like the butler's voice, which was too soft and too smooth. She did not like the way Mrs. Pike's shoulders had gone up around her ears. She stepped in. "Mr. Halsey," she said. The butler turned. His face was smooth as a plate. He bowed. "Your Grace, you will speak to Mrs. Pike as though she were a person and not a dog. If you are not able to do that, you will send her complaints to me and I will hear them, and I will not have you speak to her in that voice again in this house." The butler blinked. He was, she saw, considering whether to argue. He decided against it. He bowed again, more deeply this time, and he said, "Your Grace," and he went out. Mrs. Pike stood very still. Then she looked at Maren, and her face did an odd small thing, and she said, "Thank you, my lady. Not at all. I will make you a pie you will not forget. Please do not. I would rather you make one you will not forget. Yours matter more than mine." Mrs. Pike laughed. It was a small, startled laugh, as though she had forgotten she owned one. Maren nodded to her and went out. That evening, at supper, he set down his knife. "Halsey came to me today." "Did he?" "He said that you had corrected him in the kitchen." "I did." "He said you overstepped." "He would." He looked at her. She looked back. She did not, she found, feel afraid. She felt very awake. It was not a feeling she had had often in her life, and she noticed it as one notices a new sound in a familiar room. "Halsey has been at this house for 22 years, he said. That is a long time to be at any house. He knows how the house is run. He knows how the house was run. I am learning how it will be run." The silence held. He picked up his knife again. He cut a piece of the bread on his plate. He did not look at her. He said, quietly, "You will tell me, if you dismiss him." "I will not dismiss him. Not yet. He may learn. If he does not, I will tell you." Good. That was all. That was the end of it. They ate the rest of the meal in a quiet that was not, this time, exactly polite. It was something else. It was, she thought, the quiet of two people who had just discovered a piece of ground they could both stand on, and were not sure yet whether it would hold. She discovered him by accident. It was a Wednesday. She had gone into the small library that stood off the west corridor, because Mrs. Bell had told her that there were books there that had belonged to the last Duchess, his mother, and Marin had wanted to see what a woman who had lived in this house had chosen to read. She had thought she would be alone. She was not. He was there. He was standing at the window with his back to the room, and he had a letter in his hand, and he was not reading it. He was only holding it. His shoulders had a particular set that she had not seen before. It was the set of a man who was carrying something too heavy to put down. She started to step back. She did not want to disturb him. But he had heard her already. He turned. He saw her. He did not smile. He did not try to hide the letter. "I did not know you were here," she said. "I did not know I was here either." "Come in." She came in. She did not know what to do with herself, so she went to the shelf she had come to see, and she ran her fingers along the spines. She heard him fold the letter. She heard him put it into the drawer of a small desk by the window. She heard him close the drawer. "My mother's books," he said, quietly behind her. Yes, she read late, later than she should have. She said books were the only place she was ever alone. Marin nodded. She took down a small volume of poems. The leather was worn at the corners. Inside the cover was a name, written in a fine slanted hand. Cecily Rook, 1802. Marin looked at the name for a long time. "She died when I was 10, he said. "She was the reason I know how to speak to a woman as though she were a person, and she was the reason I do not know how to speak to a woman when I feel too much." Marin did not turn around. She stood with the book open in her hands, and she looked at the name of a woman she would never meet, and she said, "That is honest of you. You made me promise. You said no lies." "I did. I do not always know how to keep that promise, but I will try." She closed the book. She put it back on the shelf. She turned to him then, because she thought she owed him the meeting of her eyes at least, since he had given her his mother. "Thank you," she said. He bowed. He went out. She stood in the library for a long time after he had gone. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But she felt, in her chest, the small shifting weight of a thing that had begun to grow there, and she did not, for the first time, try to talk herself out of it. She learned about the boy from Mrs. Bell. It was, she supposed, the sort of thing one had to learn about eventually if one was to run a household. She had been asking about the linens, and Mrs. Bell had said, in the middle of an answer about pillowcases, that a new set had been sent last winter to the woman on Piper Lane in the village, because of the boy. And then Mrs. Bell had gone very red, because she had not, she said, meant to speak of it. "What woman?" Marin said. "What boy?" Mrs. Bell hesitated. Then she seemed to decide something, and she said, in a lower voice, that there was a woman in the village whose husband had died 2 winters back of the same fever that had taken half of the row of cottages by the mill. The woman had a boy, 5 years old, who had been very sick and had not been expected to live. His Grace had ridden down himself in the worst of the weather. His Grace had taken the physician down with him at his own cost, and had sat up with the boy through the second night when it was worst. His Grace had not told anyone he had done it. Mrs. Bell had only found out because the woman had come up to the kitchen door in the spring with a basket of eggs, and had cried on Mrs. Belle's shoulder and had said the Duke had saved her boy and would not let her thank him. "He does not know I know, Mrs. Belle said. "He would not like it that I know. He does not speak of these things. He has done other things like it. He does them all the time, Your Grace. He does not speak of any of them." Marin stood very still in the linen room with the smell of lavender and clean cotton around her. She thought of the man at supper with his knife set down, saying, "You will tell me, if you dismiss him." She thought of the man in the library saying, "She was the reason I do not know how to speak to a woman when I feel too much." She thought of the man in the little street with his hand on the wall and his shoulders shaking so faintly you would have missed it if you were not watching for it. She did not say anything to Mrs. Belle, she only nodded. She took the stack of pillowcases from Mrs. Belle's arms and she carried them to the cupboard herself. And she thought that a man who rode out in bad weather with a physician for a child he did not know was not perhaps the man his grandmother would have wanted her to marry, but he was a man she was glad, tonight, to have married. The crisis came a month later. It came in the shape of a letter, and then in the shape of a lawyer, and then in the shape of an old woman in a black carriage. His grandmother had heard, at last, of the marriage. She had heard it was to a girl from Wren Lane in Fenwick. She had, according to her lawyer, informed her banker that the funds were to be held while she saw the girl for herself. If the girl was as she had heard, the funds would go elsewhere after all. If the girl was not, they would come. The old woman arrived at 3 in the afternoon. She wore black. She wore lace. She wore a very small hat that looked like it might at any moment decide to fly away. Her cane was ivory. Her mouth was thin. She looked at Marin up and down, and Marin looked back, and neither of them curtsied for a moment longer than was quite comfortable. Then Marin curtsied. She did it properly, because her mother had taught her to be civil to old women even when the old women were being difficult. "Sit," the grandmother said. Marin sat. The grandmother sat. She set her cane across her knees. She looked at Marin for another long moment, and then she said, in the voice of a woman who had spent 70 years being very sure of every sentence she uttered, "You are a market girl. I am. You have no education. I have some. Not the kind you mean. You have no fortune. I have not. You cannot possibly know what is expected of a duchess. No, I am learning. And what makes you think you can learn?" Marin took a small breath. She looked at the old woman's hands, which were folded on the ivory cane. There was a fine tremor in them, she saw. Old hands. Tired hands. She looked back up at the old woman's face. "I did not run when a bull came at me," Marin said. "I do not think I will run from you." The room was very quiet after that. The grandmother's eyes narrowed. Then, slowly they widened again. Then, without any warning at all, the old woman laughed. It was a short, dry laugh, but it was a laugh. She lifted her cane, and she thumped it once on the floor, and she said, "Well, well," Marin said. "He said you were peculiar. He would. I do not, as it happens, mind peculiar. I mind fools. Are you a fool, my girl?" "I hope not, madam. I hope not either. Come, show me the house. I have not been in it since his father was alive, and I want to see what you have done to it." Marin stood. She held out her arm. The old woman took it, and together they walked slowly through the long, low house, and Marin showed her the small changes she had made, and the ones she was thinking of making, and the grandmother said and once, very softly. His mother would have liked that. When the grandmother went, at the end of the afternoon she paused on the step. She looked at the Duke, who had come in from the fields at some point in the visit, and who was standing now beside Marin in the doorway. She looked at Marin. She lifted her cane and tapped it once, lightly, against the doorframe. "You may tell your banker," she said, to the Duke, "that the funds will come." She went down the steps. The carriage door closed. The horses moved. The carriage went away down the long pale drive. He stood a moment. Then he turned to Marin. His face had that stillness again, the one she was learning to read. "You did not need to do that," he said. "I did." "You did not. The children in the school need the bridge." He looked at her for a very long time. "You know about the bridge," he said at last. Mrs. Belle talks in her sleep, one might say. Mrs. Belle had better not. But he was, she saw, smiling. The almost had at last become something more. It was a small smile, tired, private, but it was there, and she felt it as though it had been laid gently across her hands. That night, at supper, he was quiet for a long time. Then he set down his glass, and he looked at her and he said, "There is something I would like to tell you. Yes, there was a boy in the village. 2 winters passed. I know." He stopped. He looked at her. She did not smile. She wanted him to say it himself. He nodded, slowly, as though he had understood. "He is well now. I ride down sometimes to see him. His mother pretends not to see me. I pretend not to see her. It is easier that way. Why did you never say?" "Because it was not for saying. It was for doing." She reached across the small distance between their plates. She laid her hand on his. She did not squeeze. She just laid her hand on his, the way you lay a hand on a horse's neck when you want it to know that you are there. He did not move. Then, after a moment, he turned his hand under hers, and his palm met hers, and their fingers folded together as though they had been practicing the shape all summer. They sat like that for a long time. The clock on the mantel ticked. A log shifted in the fire. Barnaby snored softly from the rug by the door. Neither of them let go. "I should tell you," he said very quietly. "The bull that day. He was not mine because I had bought him. He was mine because I had taken him from a man I saw beating him. I meant to keep him quiet on my land. I did not judge the strength of the rope. So it was your fault," she said. "In a way. In a way. Then in a way it was your fault I did not run." He looked at her. He did not understand quite, she smiled, small, "if you had not taken that bull from that man." She said, "He would have beaten it to death in a shed, and I would never have stood in a market square while it came at me, and I would never have looked up and seen you on a grey horse. So in a way, you brought me here. All the way from a market crowd to this table. In a way." He closed his eyes. She had never seen him close his eyes in front of her before. When he opened them, they were not calm. They were wet at the edges. He did not blink the wetness away. He let her see it. He kept his hand in hers. "Marin," he said, "yes, I did not marry you for the money. I know, you know, I have known for a while. When did you know?" She thought about it. She thought about the bridge. She thought about the boy on Piper Lane. She thought about Barnaby scratching at her door on her first night in the house, and the shape she had seen at the end of the hall in the candlelight before the door closed. "The first night," she said, "you sent me the dog." "I did not send him. He went. You opened your door and let him go." "I did. That is sending." He almost laughed. This time he let it become a laugh, small and low. He lifted her hand in his, and he turned it over, and he looked at her palm as though he were trying to memorize the map of it. He did not kiss it. He only looked. Then he set it back down, still folded in his, and he said, "Stay where here with me. Not because we made a bargain. Because you would." She looked at him. She looked at their hands together on the tablecloth. She looked at the fire, and at the sleeping dog, and at the empty chair at the end of the table where they had, silly people, tried at first to sit apart. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said. He nodded. It was a small nod. It was a nod that had a great many nods folded inside it, all the ones he had not been able to give her before because he had not been sure he was allowed to. And he gave them all now in the one. They did not say anything else that evening. They finished their supper. They walked together through the long hall, with Barnaby padding at their heels. He stopped at the foot of the stairs. He kissed her, once, on the forehead. It was the first time he had put his mouth to any part of her since the day of the wedding. And he did it as gently as a man setting down a cup he does not want to break. She went up the stairs. She looked back once. He was still standing at the foot of them, watching her go. He raised his hand. She raised hers. She went the rest of the way up. In her room, she stood at the window for a long time. The river ran silver behind the house. The hills were dark. A single window across the courtyard, in the wing where his rooms were, glowed yellow, and she watched it, and she thought of him at the desk in the small library, or perhaps by the fire, or perhaps simply standing at his own window watching hers. She thought that he might tomorrow come to breakfast and act as though nothing had happened, because he was that kind of man. And she was ready for that. She thought that she could wait. She thought that they had, if they wished, a very great many mornings ahead. She thought, too, of the market square. She thought of the smell of hay and bread. She thought of the drumming of hooves on cobbles. She thought of a black bull and old blood eyes, and a rope trailing behind him. She thought of the moment when everyone had run, and the moment she had not, and the moment a hand had come around her waist like a rope, and she had been lifted into a life she had never imagined. She had not, she thought, been brave. She had only been still. But still had turned out, in the end, to be its own kind of brave. And still, it seemed, was a thing a man like him could see. She turned from the window. She went to bed. Barnaby was already there, curled at the foot, one ear cocked toward the door as though he expected another visitor. None came. The house settled around her. She closed her eyes. In the morning, at breakfast, he was there before her, which had never happened. He stood when she came in. He pulled her chair. He sat down beside her, not at the far end. He passed her the butter without her asking. Their sleeves brushed. This time she did not pull away, and neither did he. Mrs. Bell came in with the tea. Mrs. Bell looked at them, and Mrs. Bell smiled the smile of a housekeeper who has seen a thing take root and is not going to say so aloud. She poured. She went out. "I have been thinking," he said. "So have I. There is a cottage. On the river. It is small, but it is warm. Your mother might like it, if she wished. It is close enough that we could see her often. She would like it very much. I will write to her this morning. I will write to her too." They drank their tea. Outside, the sun was coming up over the hills, and the light was hitting the pale stone of the house and turning it gold. And a hound was barking somewhere down by the river, as though he had found something interesting in the reeds. It was, in every way, a very ordinary morning. It was the first ordinary morning of the rest of their lives, and neither of them, for the moment, said so, because some things do not need to be said to be true. She had not run from a bull. She had not run from an old woman with a cane. She had not run from a man who did not know how to speak when he felt too much. She had stood, and she had stood, and she had stood, and the standing had brought her, at last, to a table with buttered bread, and a warm hand near hers, and a whole house full of quiet where a home could grow. Some women were made for running. She, it turned out, had been made for staying, and this was the place, and this was the man, and this was the morning she had been staying for all along.